this video, I will be um, providing an overview of my perspective of white supremacy and whiteness, what those things are, and also be sharing a bit about the connections of white supremacy with mental health. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about why I'm doing this. So, um, I'm sure many of us have seen the acts of white supremacist violence committed by shooters recently. Um, and it strikes me as very important to be able to, with this channel, be able to talk about and address what's causing people to take these actions on a societal level. Because, individual cases will be different, but on a social level, these things keep happening. And we need to talk about why. And specifically, part of why I'm making these videos is, as a white person myself, to encourage and facilitate conversation amongst white people about our own race education, about how we live out race, about how white supremacy influences us. Um, so I'm going to be introducing a new, if you look at my channel, I have different playlists, which are sort of overviews of different types of topics, broadly categorizing my videos into different playlists, but there will be overlap. Um, this is going to be a specific playlist which I want to identify and bring attention to. That playlist is for white people. Conversation, dialogue, um, really for a space for us to unpack our whiteness. And so if you're not white, you're very welcome to be watching those videos. You're very welcome to watch this video. Um, but um, Also, we're a ways away from me having a busy comment section. So this may not apply yet, but there's a possibility that, or a likelihood that at some point in the future, the comments of my videos about whiteness will be white people being racist and unpacking their white supremacy. And if you're white, I actually want to encourage this if you're doing it in good faith to talk about some of your beliefs that you have and to be reflecting with other white people on your beliefs, on their beliefs. Um, and if you're not white, you don't want to see those comments, this is your heads up. I will be deleting comments of people just using slurs or who are very attacking other people, because this does need to be like a safe space for us to have conversations and hopefully not just vitriolic arguments, but open inquiries into ourselves and our experiences and our socialization. Because, yeah, the other point I want to make is that a lot of these white supremacist extremists are being radicalized online by people in places like YouTube. People go down these white supremacist rabbit holes. Also places like 4chan and Reddit. Um, People are turning to the internet for answers for their life, just to understand why things are the way they are. And they're being met with um, algorithms which are leading them down this path. So for this reason, it's very important for me to combat this. There's plenty of non-white educators and people sharing their perspective who have great information, but I think specifically as a white person, you know, I can maybe suggest a white space for us to talk in ways that they can't, even though their perspective is very valuable. It's a little different. So this is really to help for us to have conversations. And so, yeah, if you're white, and especially if this is your first video of mine that you're seeing, I really hope you stick around. Um, so, yeah, um, let's get into it. I'm going to talk about the origins of white supremacy, and I'm going to talk about white supremacy as a system, and then I will talk about white supremacy as it influences the mental health field. Um, as usual with these early videos, it's going to be a pretty broad overview, and at some point in the future, a lot of these concepts I may expand out and make into full videos just to give them more space, talk about them, and expand on them. Um, so yeah, um, origins of white supremacy. Where does that come from? Um, well, the most important thing, I think, is to mention that it is completely made up. The idea that white is even a category that's real is made up. Um, and the question of how it's made up is through a process of mythologizing whiteness, white civilization, white culture, like you, like white supremacists invoke this history by altering the details of the past to make it seem like there's this linear civilization that has advanced all of the like medical, technological, cultural advances, and that everyone involved in this linear path of civilization is white, and that those outside of this path are like, dirty and underdeveloped and not really full people. If you look at any white supremacist movement or history or project, you will find them mythologizing and being very historically inaccurate. Why? Because that is what their myth depends on, is because that's not how history works. History is nonlinear. Um, Cultural sharing is nonlinear. And the categorization of like, is someone or is a culture white is very context dependent and it changes. And so sometimes when we look back with like our modern perspective and we say, oh, well, this was white, that's really not what was going on there. So, like, um, for instance, white supremacists in the US now like to mythologize about, Romans and Vikings, um, Greeks, these different cultures, which are very much part of like the canon of like what mainstream society considers to be white. Because this is not just something that small groups of people or fascists are doing, but this is like a myth that is part of many bigger systems that people are picking up on. So the one big example I'll make is that Nazi Germany also did this. They mythologized Aryans and said they're the greatest, they're white, they did all this conquering, they did all this stuff. Um, Aryans were not white. I believe that they were from like North India, and they didn't even do all the stuff that the Nazis said that they did. Um, so Nazis very much have to invent this like false myth, and like also this tends to be connected with nationalism, like creating this false image of the nation that you're in as being like the best, and maybe connecting to like, oh, like we're the inheritors of like this empire, like we're part of this long tradition of being like conquerors in this way. And you also can see how this is connected to war and militarism and patriarchal masculinity. All of these things are very intimately connected. Um, but so yeah, there really is this process of mythologizing. And one of the sources I will share in the comments is a book I read about Nazi propaganda. They actually learned a lot from the American advertising industry at the time in terms of like different concepts they would use for you know creating these concepts and disseminating them and like manipulating the ways that people would think. Um, so yeah, there's also this idea of like cultural classics or like that some culture is like highbrow, like better than others. That is like part of this myth making process of white supremacy. So you see like renowned authors who are from outside of this like white supremacist like line from the past into the present tend to get pushed aside and not remembered. And I think also not remembering is a core tenet of white supremacy, like not remembering the things that don't fit the narrative. Um, so there's this mythologizing. I'll leave that there. Um, Also, the idea of race as being a construct, race as a social construct to justify war and slavery. Um, you know, um, I'm sure you may have heard, or maybe you haven't, but this idea of race as a social construct. Well, what does that mean when it affects the way that like a lot of things are? How could it be just a construct? Well, a construct, when we say something is a social construct, what that means is that there is no like there is nothing we could point to and say like it has to be this way, but that over like many years of like culture and the ways that we've treated each other and like different traditions, something becomes a certain way, but that it doesn't have to be that way, and that as radicals we can change those constructs. So race is a social construct that originated as a way to justify war and slavery and exploitation. Um, so, and um, citing my sources is a little difficult because I feel like I've learned a lot from different people on social media that I wouldn't even know, like all of who they are and like a lot of conversations I've had. Um, so that's a little hard. Um, One important piece, a book I've read is Dead the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. I talked about that in my book, The History, or in my video about capitalism, the effects on mental health, which I will have linked on the sidebar and in the description. Um, yeah, he really talks about um, like slavery had existed prior to capitalism as a form of um, like paying for like bad actions or like a debt that a family member had, but specifically chattel slavery, which is where all of your descendants are also slaves, and in which like your property to be bought and sold um, is specifically coming out of the invention of race and racism. So dehumanizing people to be able to do that, differentiating between white and non-white populations because like a white person can like work and like be treated as like a domestic worker who is owned by someone who has more wealth and power, whereas a slave is not someone who is working but is property which they like get to tell what to do. Like the difference is like hiring someone to come and clean for you, and then like when they're done, and there's a rate and they're working, versus like your Roomba, which like you can take care of it. It can run around and do its thing, but it's not leaving your home if you don't want it to. And you also can throw it around and smash it up because it's your property. You can't do that with people you hire because they have rights. Slaves do not have rights. Um, and also the piece around war is like an exploitation is that because of this white supremacist myth of saying non-white people are like savages or like underdeveloped, and it like presents um, the white colonizers as being on the side of moral goodness in coming in and like teaching them like the right way to be a civilization or a society. But it's a setup because they're really there for exploitation and to harm, not to not to help. Because if they were there to help, all the colonizers, all the people coming with religion, different things, if they were there to help, the first thing they would do is to say, hey, how can we help? Rather than coming in and saying, we know the answers. So, race is a construct that honestly is not that old in the whole span of human history. Um, but so the next piece I want to just mention is um, John Brown and the Harper's Ferry raid. And this is an important, I think, piece to bring up and to talk about is this was like the let me pull up the page. This was um, in I think the mid 1800s. Um, that John Brown was a white man who tried to steal weapons and incite a slaves' rebellion because he was slavery abolitionist and wanted to do something about it. And it was because slaveholders and the property owning classes were so afraid of the possibility of white and black working class people um, merging together against them that that they gave more rights to the white workers and fewer rights to the black slaves to sort of present to the poor white people like, hey, um, you want to hold on to the slim things that you have, or else you can end up like those people over there. Um, and there's a whole history in terms of connection with how policing, in a modern sense, grew out of like white people being brought in to police black slaves. And um, also the connection with the Haitian Revolution, which took place a little while later, um, that um, Southern plantation owners in particular were so afraid of a slaves revolt because they had seen a successful slave revolt in Haiti against France that they really cracked down heavily. But the other important piece to mention is um, in the US education system, I and probably most people was taught that slaves sort of just accepted their fate and didn't have a good time of it, but did their best. Um, Revolts were commonplace, like people trying to escape or trying to fight back. And it is part of this white supremacist um, just forgetting that we lose this legacy of resistance. Um, so, this is a little bit about the origins of white supremacy with a particular look at um, the US at the end here. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about white supremacy as a system. So a lot of times when people are talking about white supremacy or when people are talking about racism, it gets presented as if it's like a matter of individual belief system or bad actions or ideology. And that's certainly a part of it, but ironically, part of white supremacy as a system is this focus on individuals and individualism over groups and systems. So It's actually that white supremacy is a system that influences all of the other systems in our society. Um, think of it as like a set of rules. So, like, or a set of rules or beliefs that are then interpreted and followed by different people in different systems, and they'll be interpreted and followed in different ways. Like, white supremacy is a bit like just like the rules of the game, and the rules are flexible, like they'll change depending on like the edition or who's playing. And those rules get interpreted by different systems. I'll share with you a few examples. There's the legal system, which will, punish people at different rates based on their race. There's housing. Different people get better funding to be able to get houses and different rates of um, evaluations. There's jobs, all types of employment discrimination, as well as racism in the workplace. There's intimate relationships and politics of desirability, as well as the way that race can show up within like the way that families interact with each other. And yeah, I think the really important thing, the message to bring home is that white supremacy is not even like one single defined belief system. White supremacy is like the backbone of literally everything. And you can maybe sum up what that is as being like race is real, one, race is biologically determined, and the white race is the best race. And then you have all of these systems that are set up in place to create this fiction, this myth, and to keep it that way. Um, so wherever there is like discussion of, or wherever you could see race, wherever it's possible for race to exist, it does. And white supremacy is at work to um, put white people on top. And there's a hierarchy of different people in different situations being in different positions relative to whiteness, but that white people are always at the top. Um, the next piece I'll add is that the violence of white supremacy exists along a continuum. It is not so straightforward as to say, well, we have these acts of white supremacist violence, they're isolated, that's the only violence. Actually, the violence is always a part of the rules. Those rules I had mentioned, I actually didn't write out what I think those rules are. Maybe I'll do that another time. But um, the violence is always present anywhere the white supremacy is present. And so at the smallest scale, you have something like a microaggression. What is a microaggression? A microaggression is something that's a bit of a slight that can happen in any context where it's like, oh, that seems like a racist thing to say or do or think or believe, that then the non white person feels a little bit harmed or alienated by that, or like they don't belong in the space. Um, and the point I want to make with microaggressions is that they are ambiguous, and that's part of what makes it hard. But because of it's this specific instance, it's ambiguous. But within the larger context, you know that there are rules of white supremacy that are always being applied. And so you can say whether or not this specific incidence you can interpret as this was racist or this was not racist, the rules are always applying. So it is. Like, when in doubt, it is. Um, so one example is, maybe white coworker not holding the door open for their non-white coworker, but they did hold it open for the white coworker who was like a step in front of them. You could say, oh, they didn't see them. You could say that. But when you look at the presence of white supremacy and racism in the workplace, and that this person is white and that they've been exposed to white supremacist ideas, beliefs, and practices their entire life, and that this non white person has been primed to see whiteness everywhere in order to keep themselves safe, um, that yes, whether or not this person intended this to be a white supremacist act, it was given the larger context. So, this is a continuum, a spectrum of violence. This is sort of on the smaller scale, and then it expands out. So, on the larger scale, you have things like war, or militarism, or policing, or white supremacist shooters, or borders. All of these big systemic like acts or instances or systems of violence are all connected to the rules of white supremacy, the system, the ways that um, policing interacts with a given group of people are always going to be connected to white supremacy, the rules that we had discussed. Um, the function of policing is intimately connected to white supremacy, the rules and belief systems. So I'm sure you can imagine that there's a whole lot more here that we could talk about, and also that I alone maybe don't have all of the information. So I would encourage you to do further research. Um, Next, we're going to just talk a little bit about white supremacy and mental health. So, a few examples. One, and I feel like a really big one, is the role of white supremacy in parenting and the family system, like how that, like where that's coming from. So I think like with there's like a there within white families there is um, a norm of a lack of emotional connection. Um, Parents tend to either be very strict and authoritarian or very permissive and neglectful, either letting the young person do whatever they want or being very like um, very very strict and very harsh with them. Um, White supremacy can show up in parenting as like infantilizing and denying agency to the young person. Also, a lot of our like like sexuality, relationships, gender, all of that is like the first place we're really indoctrinated into the cis heteropatriarchal belief systems is within families. So I think that's like on the one hand you have here like white families and like the way that whiteness is like instituted, and then in non-white families you have the impacts of intergenerational trauma on like the ways that people are trying to keep their family members safe. So the way that like punishments or yelling or hitting can be used as a way of getting young people to fear authority so that they appropriately fear the white authorities that they will run into. That is one, a consequence of the trauma of white supremacy, and two, it's a little bit there to help keep them safe in the future. So I think it's like white supremacy shows up in these different ways in different groups depending on how those people are exposed or part of the broader system. Um, but it's like I'll say again, like white supremacy is always present in all systems because it's part of the rules that our society is set up under. So parenting, it's throughout. Um, and I just wanted to specify that one because when we talk about the mental health connotations, a lot of the biggest impacts on our mental health happen in our earliest developmental years because our minds, our bodies, our social connections are all still developing. And so those early years of what we're exposed to within a family context can have some of the largest impacts. But certainly in other places as well, and I'll list a few examples. schools, prisons, hospitals, the medical system, the media. Um, White supremacy runs through all of these systems. It affects all of them in the ways that they conceptualize their own role, in the way that they move through the world, make certain decisions. White supremacy is always present. Um, so the other specific one I want to talk about is within the therapy world. So white supremacy shows up in the therapy world as individual approaches to systemic issues or systemic problems. You know, the connection between white supremacy and alienating, isolating an individual away from their community. The way that, you know, as a therapist, I can't, have a therapy session with the entire country and say, maybe we need to work on our emotions, everyone. Um, it is an individual approach to an issue which is much bigger than the individual. And that's not to say the individual can't make changes or, that it doesn't help, but it is fundamentally not fixing the systemic issues. Um, Also, a lot of types of therapy, a lot of therapists blame the victim. A lot of therapy theories are set up to do this, to blame the person, to say, like, well, you're bad or you're wrong for being this way, and like, we're going to change you. And this is intimately connected with the individual approach to systemic issues. Because if you say, well, it's not a system issue, it's an individual issue, it follows that the next thing you would say is, there's something wrong with the individual, we need to fix them. That is a white supremacist rule or belief. Um, Connected again to this is pathologizing, or what that word means is turning something into a sign of disease or sickness. So pathologizing and medicalizing, meaning using medications. Um, Pathologizing and medicalizing, common experiences that we all have in response to the systemic issues. So to individualize a problem, blame the victim, and then say that this is a medical problem and we're going to use medical solutions, when so much of the things that we struggle with in our society are related to the ways that white supremacy is showing up in other systems, in other spaces. And so, within the context of white supremacy, the mental health world serves this role of getting us to see ourselves as the problem rather than that our issues are being derived from systemic problems. And the last piece I'll mention in regards to the medicalizing is that we have medications that, and I'm not blaming anyone who uses medications. I'm not saying get off of them right away. What I will say about our use of medications in the mental health world is that we have medications, and what they do is they soothe our nervous systems. And that can be helpful in a lot of context. But are they resolving the issues that cause our nervous systems to be dysregulated in the first place? They're not. That's not their role. They can't do that. So rather than addressing the root cause of the issue, the white supremacist mental health system seeks to just numb us out so that we can't complain. And again, this is a brief overview because I could get so much more deep into the white supremacy in many of these systems, and in particular the mental health system. Um, so, okay, so let's wrap up. Um, it's going to be very important for us to have conversations moving forward about whiteness and white supremacy, for us as white people. And this, I'm specifically addressing white people, although non-white people are also very welcome to watch these videos if you find them helpful. But I specifically want to make space for white people, for us to process the role of white supremacy in our lives, and to talk about combating that. What does that look like? And to be in solidarity with non-white people. So, um, yeah, I think it's very important to back up these conversations with solidarity and meaningful action, meaningful support. So we'll get there. There will be more videos talking about that. Um, Next, or maybe not right away next, but soon, I'll be sharing a video about my own journey through whiteness, my own process of reaching the point where I am now, because I feel like it's important for me to be vulnerable if I'm asking for you to do that. Um, I actually tried to record that video before this one and found myself floundering because I hadn't defined my terms. So that's a very important thing to do. Now that I have defined what whiteness and what white supremacy are to a small degree, because of course there is more to be said, I have a little bit now of a foundation to talk about my own journey through whiteness, which is what you can expect pretty soon. So, you know, if you, in particular, if you're white and you want to continue to be part of these conversations, please subscribe. Also, you're very welcome to stick around. I make other types of content as well if you're not white. Um, and, leave a comment about sort of topics you might be looking forward to talking about in connection with whiteness. And I'll see if I can incorporate them, or even just sharing about your own journey or experience through whiteness. Um, or if you're not white, sharing about, your perception of white supremacy in your life too. Yeah, if you can, I also have a Patreon that'll be linked in the description. And yeah, I'll see you next time.